folks at Columbia who have helped me think through aspects of the project, namely Alex Gill and Nicole Wallach. All right, so I'm going to start the talk now. A letter home describing a Christmas party in prison. A detailed family history for a 15-year-old who has run away from home. A photograph of a girl on a picnic bench signed as a memento to a friend that she made while incarcerated. A warrant for a 14-year-old girl who was, quote, disobedient to her lawful superiors and in danger of having her morals depraved. These are some of the contents of a box full of case files and institutional records dated in the 1920s from the Hudson Training School for Girls, a prison for young women between the ages of 12 and 15 incarcerated as juvenile delinquents in Hudson, New York. The box was discovered at a garage sale in Hudson, and its miscellaneous collection of intake forms, letters, legal documents, and photographs not only helped to fill out the training school's institutional history, but also began to illuminate the lived experiences of the young women who were incarcerated there for a portion of their adolescence. With little information about who had kept the documents and how they had wandered beyond institutional walls, the box filled with fragmented records present their handlers with question: how might we best piece together these experiences, and might those glimpses into young women's lives close to 100 years ago shed light on our current social landscape today? My Public Humanities project, which for the purpose of this talk is somewhat broadly titled Teaching from the Archive of Women's Incarceration, aims to facilitate students' encounter with archival materials from, and similar to, the ephemera and records found in the box of case files in Hudson, which have often been enclosed in state archives, forgotten in basements, or otherwise left unmentioned in family conversations or town histories, despite the tremendous impact that the prison system has had in shaping social experience in the United States. Specifically, I've partnered with the Prison Public Memory Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to recovering, interpreting, and presenting the artifacts and cultural memories of prisons in the U.S. and the communities with which they were entwined. I'm working with the project staff to develop curricular materials and activities that might be used in a variety of classrooms. The goal is to enable students to encounter, learn about, and piece together the archival fragments and stories about imprisonment, the way they shaped individual lives, and the prison's role in different communities, so that students might begin to make connections between the past and the present, and to talk about and think about how mass incarceration shapes our social realities today. The first trial run for some of these teaching materials will happen in July at the Social Justice Leadership Academy, which is a collaborative workshop and leadership and sort of community organizing training program for teenagers in Hudson run over the summer. The Leadership Academy's main objective, and this description is actually taken from their website, is to, quote, support young people in identifying and understanding issues affecting their lives, and in taking leadership as crucial change makers within their communities. Before launching into the body of this talk, I also wanted to give a little background information about the Prison Public Memory Project and the work it's currently focusing on, so that you can better understand sort of the curriculum project's context. So currently, the Prison Public Memory Project is based in Hudson, New York. That's where it was originally founded. And the project is working to recover and document material from different prisons that Hudson is housed. The first prison that was originally in Hudson is the House of Refuge for Women, which is actually the first women's prison in New York State, and the second prison designed only for women in the US. And that was opened in 1887 as a reformatory for women, and it was closed in 1904. In 1904, the facility that facility became the New York State Training School for Girls, and the training school was open until 1975, and girls ages 12 to 15 were incarcerated there. And now the Hudson Correctional Facility, which is a medium security prison for men, is currently in operation on the grounds near where the House of Refuge and Training School currently existed, or formerly existed, sorry. So the Prison Public Memory Project is currently based in Hudson, but it plans to eventually bring its methods of documentation, presentation, and collaboration to other communities throughout the U.S. And the Prison Public Memory Project, or I'll sometimes say PPMP, because it kind of is a quicker way to get through the whole title, is invested in working closely with the communities in the towns and cities where it is recovering historical sources about imprisonment. Which is one of the reasons that we're starting the Teaching Materials Project in Hudson itself. So in this talk, I want to touch on three main subjects. And the first is what sparked my interest in putting together this particular kind of public humanities project. So sort of the framework from which the project emerged. Second, the process of actually developing the partnership and collaborating on the curriculum materials with the Prison Public Memory Project. And that's really still a work in progress and currently unfolding. So the news you get about it will be kind of hot off the press of what we're working on right now. And then finally, some ideas about where I hope to see the project go in the future. And I've sort of gestured towards those throughout the talk. In addressing these topics, I also want to think about some ways in which bringing archival material about imprisonment into a teaching environment might provide a resource for talking about incarceration in the US, as well as hopefully responsibly and respectfully redrawing the boundaries of an archive that has often been closed off or stigmatized. So the first part. The seeds for putting together this curricular project were planted in my brain by two different sets of experiences. First would be my time doing archival research on women's incarceration, and second, my experiences teaching about incarceration. So my dissertation research focuses on the development of the women's prison as its own separate institution in the early 20th century US. And because I'm in an English department, it also focuses on the body of literature that emerged in tandem with those early prisons that were designed specifically for women. A large part of my dissertation research, then, has taken me into state archives to work through institutional records, mainly case files, to better understand the structure of these early prisons and also the ways they shape the lives of those who are incarcerated in them. As I read through many pages of meticulous staff reports that detailed women's histories prior to their imprisonment, parole reports, letters exchanged between women and families, notes exchanged between inmates, and occasionally poetry and even plays that the women wrote during their time in prison, I was able to begin to piece together narratives and at least get a partial sense of what incarcerated women's everyday lives were like during their imprisonment and sometimes afterwards as well. This process of looking through piles of documents that recorded how different aspects of women's lives were repeatedly dismissed, controlled, and stigmatized could often be really depressing, as was the feeling that so much of their experience was deemed unimportant and potentially lost to documentation altogether, despite how many notes staff sociologists took about each woman. But on the flip side, a lot about my time in the archive was energizing. So as I said before, encountering the fragments and sort of minutiae of women's everyday experiences and the process of beginning to piece back together lives whose real presence in the historical record was often their criminalization, felt like a way to respect those lives a bit more, even if it raised a lot of questions about how best to represent women's experiences. Moreover, during this research process, I was also struck by how both the structure of the prison and its effects on women's lives resonated with the realities of our own moments of mass incarceration and violent policing. And here I'm thinking about the way that the criminal justice system sort of started to supervise family relationships, or how children and teenagers began to be criminalized as juvenile delinquents. While it's not really a new revelation that better understanding the past can clarify our present, it seemed to me that these glimpses into the experiences of incarcerated young women could help us make sense of the long history of imprisonment in the US, and perhaps shed more light on aspects of that history and sort of reality that don't always make their way into mainstream discourse on incarceration. So, for example, women prisoners are actually the fastest growing population of incarcerated people in the US, but that's not a frequently mentioned fact or something we talk about a lot. Interestingly, while a really significant swath of New York State's historic prison records have recently been digitized and made available online, these records are all from men's prisons, which may have had, maybe a women's wing for a period of time, but the records of many women's prisons remain less accessible in the state archives in Albany. So you have to drive up there to look at them. So as I was spending this time doing research in kind of an isolated vacuum, I became really interested in finding a way to bring these insights into the past, out of the enclosure of the state archive, and into a more contemporary setting. My academic writing is invested in making this move too, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people in this room are familiar with the academic publishing process. It's a slow one, and the audience that you're realistically going to address is going to be very small and specialized. So bringing the process of carefully and closely reading this kind of archival material to students in a classroom seemed like a really exciting and more immediate possibility, and one with the potential to involve a wider range of people. The second set of experiences that sparked my interest in this project were related to actually teaching about incarceration. And I found that as I sought to incorporate writing about the contemporary prison system into syllabi and class discussion, and this is mainly in my freshman composition classes at Columbia, and I was just using essays that were written about the justice system. Students didn't really always have a shared vocabulary to talk about the issues that the pieces raised, as their experiences really varied. Some students had been formerly incarcerated or had family members who had been incarcerated, but many other students' only exposure to the criminal justice system was through media like Law and Order episodes. And it's worth saying is that as a teacher, I brought my own experiences as a white middle-class person whose understanding of the prison system had mainly been shaped by working in the criminal justice system before grad school.
Miss Hainze, I'm old and I cannot hear that well, so you can raise your voice a little bit.
Okay.
Would benefit me.
Are people in the back having trouble hearing me? Oh, I'm sorry. All right, I'll start shouting. Okay, so because crime and imprisonment had very different meanings for students within the classroom and could spark defensiveness and frustration, it often felt like the academic essay at hand was inadequate for engendering a thoughtful and thorough conversation. How's that? Can people hear better? Okay. And I, of course, these conversations were facilitated by my own developing teaching practices, so I just want to note that. Nevertheless, I increasingly became interested in how different methods, pedagogical formats, and teaching materials might be employed to catalyze a responsible discussion about the role incarceration has played in the United States, and to think about new ways to read, write, and respond to how the prison has become an integral part of the American landscape. Do you need this one? Oh, that would be great. Thanks. Thank you. So the project I've been working on with the Prison Public Memory Project, developing teaching materials to accompany their archival sources, brings together my interest in finding a method and practice for bringing in some of the documents I had encountered in the archive into a more current conversation, and my interest in finding different materials for facilitating classroom conversations about incarceration. I had taught writing and literature classes in correctional facilities previously, so I had some experience bringing my training in literature into prisons. And on a somewhat related note, I'm actually looking forward to teaching a summer course on the literary humanities, which begins in just a week or two, through the Center of Justice here at Columbia for students who were formerly incarcerated. The nature of this project, however, is somewhat different from a class or a workshop that might take place in a prison, though in a sense, both formats might attempt to facilitate learning experiences that are collaborative and potentially unsettle preconceptions about what's criminal, quote unquote, and bring up a dialogue about the role of criminal justice in the U.S. Here instead, the process of drawing from records of past forms of incarceration is intended to give students tools to interpret and respond to that history, and to begin to think about its potential connections to and differences from the present. So this brings me to the next portion of my talk, which is how I actually started out and developed the framework and logistics for the curriculum project with the Prison Public Memory Project. And now that I'm looking back on how the project has progressed, I would divide this process into three parts. And the first phase of the project was actually developing a relationship with my central community partner, which is the Prison Public Memory Project, identifying how our interests and skill sets may overlap. The second step was narrowing down and refining the project's concept and developing a working relationship with the PPMP. And then the third phase, which we're currently in, is actually developing the teaching materials themselves, nailing down the logistics for our first workshop with those materials, and looking towards the future of, for the teaching project. So, thinking about how we might make the teaching materials available for other classroom settings. So, first phase. Identifying and forming the partnership. I knew of the Prison Public Memory Project when I applied for the Public Humanities Fellowship because my research into women's prisons in the progressive era overlapped with their work recovering documents from these early institutions for women and girls in Hudson. So I was really excited about sort of the writing and sources that they had posted on their website, and I reached out to the organization and got in touch with Tracy Huling, who's their founding director, and I got to know her a little bit over email and then in person. And because we shared research interests, we were trying to figure out how we might collaborate in a project about developing teaching tools and materials that would make portions of the Prison Public Memories archive accessible for a classroom or workshop setting seemed like a great opportunity for collaboration. The organization had not yet developed a method or platform for making their archive of primary sources documents available for classroom use, and they were obviously very interested in reaching out to and engaging with different communities in order to start a conversation about the historic and current role of prisons in society. So working in a classroom setting definitely fit that bill. And as I've briefly sketched, I was interested in different methods for bringing the history of incarceration into the classroom, which potentially might draw on archival sources about imprisonment. So once we identified how our interests and motives overlapped, we were able to come up with the kernel of a project that would involve developing a set of teaching materials from and about the Prison Public Memories archive. Next step. The next step in making the project a reality was coming up with a concrete and manageable concept design that everyone with stakes in developing the teaching materials was excited about. And this phase mainly involved researching, and in some cases testing out different models and methods that we might draw from, and then trying to nail down concrete goals for developing our own teaching materials. So initially, the project I envisioned and that we had talked about was more elaborate and also more abstract, as the beginning of such collaborations can be. So bear with me as I explain this. The basic idea was that both the archival materials and teaching activities and guidelines would be available through what we were calling a portal, featured through the Prison Public Memory Project's website, and that in an ideal world, the different groups of students that use the project materials in their classrooms would be able to contribute their analysis of primary sources to the website for other students to potentially refer to, making the portal sort of a collaborative educational space, which might give students a sense of creating an archive of their own. My inspiration for this kind of portal was drawing on the collaborative educational websites that I had encountered previously, and I was especially influenced by an online model that the editors for the Keywords for American Cultural Studies series had developed. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but their online resource has what's called a Wiki Collaboratory, where different classrooms could post writing about particular keywords that they had researched and written about, and potentially draw from resources that other groups of students had created. In the fall semester of this academic year, I actually had the chance to sort out a version of this collaboratory tool that revolved around thematic keywords as a way of making sense of historical documents when I taught a literature seminar on women's crime and incarceration in the early 20th century. I asked the students in the seminar to pick a keyword from the words that we selected together. So there's really major themes that we had talked about in class, and like crime, for example. And the students found archival sources which they annotated and uploaded to our course wiki for all to view and to refer to as they researched their final papers. So sort of translating this to the case of the Prison Public Memories curriculum project, one of my ideas was that we would curate a specific set of archival sources for a theme that we pre-selected and ask students to annotate those documents and create a kind of written report about how the keyword related to the archival material. While other students from other classrooms could then access those keywords on the Prison Public Memory Project's website. However, I found that this activity required a fair amount of integration into the course's curriculum. It worked really well as a research and writing activity for a college classroom that was, already focused on a particular historical period, and, was sort of arranged as sort of we had a lot of material leading up to that activity. But as we considered what format would be best to present the archival materials to a range of students, it seemed as though this collaboratory wiki might not work or be as transportable to different settings, where there might be limited time to work with the historical context and primary documents. As we talked it through, a key part of the project for the Prison Public Memory Project was creating materials that would be used not only in a university classroom. So that initial schema didn't quite work right away, although we might use aspects of that plan in the future. But regardless, it was a way to try out one potential format and to provide a concrete example to discuss with my collaborators. In general, I found it really useful both for clarifying my own thinking about project design and also for communicating my ideas to the nonprofit, to find some solid, concrete examples of different kinds of teaching materials that had been developed and placed online to talk about social history. And here I'm thinking not only of the Wiki Collaboratory, but also the format of materials from organizations such as Facing History and Ourselves and Teaching Tolerance, which is a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I definitely recommend checking out their websites if you're interested in this material. While the format and actual objects of study didn't line up exactly with the Prison Public Memories archive, they still enabled me to talk and think more precisely about what aspects might work or would not work for a particular project in collaboration, especially when we were in the early brainstorming stages of the project. So, for example, which classrooms exactly were we trying to reach, and what sort of framing historical context would we need to provide records, to make records about women's imprisonment meaningful for students. The other challenge in working to come up with the project concept was learning to communicate in terms that were familiar and made sense to the group as people who either were working in a nonprofit context, so that would be the Prison Public Memory Project, or mainly in an academic context, and that would be me. And so as an academic beginning to work in the field of public humanities, I think there is a step or two, which might seem really commonsensical, but it was news to me, that I would take in future projects that helped to facilitate collaboration with different stakes in the teaching project that we were working on together. So something I found very important was how the proposed project was framed for my partners in collaboration. At least in my experience working as a graduate student in literature, I've tended to write ambitious proposals for projects that also tend to be a bit nebulous, whether it's an academic fellowship or a dissertation prospectus. I write them knowing things will probably change down the road, but appreciating the chance to specifically imagine what the project would ideally look like within reason. And of course, and again, this might be obvious, that's not usually or always the case for people working in other fields. So for example, Tracy, the founding director of the Prison Public Memory Project, has been in policy for a long time and has been working in prison reform. So, it's much more task-oriented field. In the case of working with another group of collaborators and or an organization, then it seems helpful to go into the project with more tangible and attainable goals and then allow the project to evolve from those more modestly stated initial goals. Or maybe to make a distinction between preliminary goals and a more macro vision of what the project might eventually evolve into. Articulating short-term goals also allowed us to define the role each collaborator might play in working towards those ends. So we were able to sort of define what our skill sets were and what we were able to contribute to reaching the short-term goals that we had set. What's more, this refocusing ended up being a useful lesson not only in public humanities style collaboration, it also provided the basis for our current approach to developing teaching materials, which is to engage with the local community in Hudson and to start building a template for other classroom settings from those experiences. And that brings us to step 3, which is actually executing the project itself. Once I started working through the primary sources that the Prison Public Memory Project had collected and then scanned or recorded and placed online, my central task was actually selecting which documents to use for instructional purposes and to start generating the teaching materials themselves. And here I've been working really closely with Brian Buckley, who oversees all things related to the Hudson sites for the Prison Public Memory Project. We're planning what will likely be a 2-day workshop through the Social Justice Leadership Academy, which, as I said before, is located in Hudson and run by 2 organizations. One organization called Kite's Nest, which provides programming for teenagers in the Hudson area, and the Staley B. Keith Social Justice Center, which is a community organizing center whose focus is on empowering the Black community in Hudson. The goal of the Summer Academy is to help students explore their identities, connect their lived experience to structural power relations, and that's sort of what's stated on their website. I don't want to plagiarize them. And in past years, they've featured workshops focused on community and event organizing, radio and music production, and public arts. So having the workshop set up in Hudson and within the Social Justice Leadership Academy, we're hoping will fulfill 2 purposes. First, it will enable the Prison Public Memory Project to work with people who live in Hudson on the specific histories of the prisons that have been housed there, and in a setting where students are already sort of focused on public life and social justice. And second, it will allow us to generate, hopefully, a template for teaching materials that's somewhat flexible. So things like, historical context for the archival sources, a lesson plan or 2, that might be placed on the Prison Public Memories Project's website or otherwise made available upon request from the PPMP. for educators and students who may not live in Hudson. And then last, we're hoping that the workshop will give the students a chance to potentially exhibit, if they're game, some creative and interpretive work that they have composed in response to the archival materials on the Prison Public Memory Project's website. So basically, we decided to start with a specific workshop and a set of teaching materials and documents and build out from those experiences. And the objectives for the lesson plans and activities that we wanted to come up with were very broadly to facilitate conversations about how incarceration shapes individual and social experience in the U.S., paying attention to race and gender, to give students new skills for interpreting primary source material and connecting it to present-day realities, and to enable students to respond creatively to both past and present forms of incarceration, and potentially to provide a platform for exhibiting those responses. So when I read through and occasionally listened to the archival, to the actual archival research and documents that the Prison Public Memory Project has preserved and placed online, they have a Google Drive where they've sort of preserved all these documents and oral histories from the House of Refuge, which was mainly census records and the institution's annual reports, to oral histories from the staff members of the training school in the 1960s. It seemed to me that the richest and most varied material for the purposes of a workshop was in what the organization called the Durfee box. And it was named for the woman, Lisa Durfee, who discovered this box at a garage sale. Many of the contents that I described at the beginning of the talk were in it. So it was a box of records and ephemera from case files that sought to diagnose and detail young women's lives during their time incarcerated at the training school in the 1920s. While these records are incomplete and fragmented, they provide narratives from both the point of view of the institution's staff, who were interested in controlling and reforming their charges, as well as from the point of view of the young women themselves, as they negotiated the constraints placed on them in this institution as well as post-imprisonment. What's more, the files from the box also contain photographs, which might enable the students to encounter archival sources both textually and visually. With this specific focus, I was able to get to work with Brian on actually selecting the documents for the workshop. So next, I want to share some examples of the materials we're in the process of working with right now for the workshop in July. And the workshop, as I said, will likely be for 2 days, depending on the Social Justice Leadership Academy schedule. And I think one day will also be devoted to an on-site sort of archival sleuthing activity that Tracy and Brian have come up with. That's about the training school in the 1930s, when the singer Ella Fitzgerald was actually incarcerated there for a period of time. And I haven't been as involved in this aspect, but I'm sure Brian would be happy to talk about it if people have questions. The main challenge in developing materials for the workshop has been selecting documents that are representative of the young women's experiences in the Hudson Training School, providing enough context for the documents that they are meaningful for the students, and designing discussion and activity templates to facilitate student conversation and interpretive response to the documents. So right now the plan is to begin the workshop by giving the students relevant history and context to understand what the Hudson Training School was, and give them some background information about the development of the juvenile justice system, which really began to solidify as a system of incarceration in the first decades of the 20th century. As immigration, migration, modernizing industry transformed the American landscape. In this introductory contextualization, we will also talk about the form of the case file itself, so why the institution kept those files, what sort of forms were in them, and how they were used to document the lives of the young women. So, for example, what was an intake form? Why were the training school staff so interested in recording, every detail of the women's or girls' family histories? And then finally, we might talk about questions that the documents begin to raise for us as contemporary readers looking back at this history. So we're hoping to preserve a version of this background information and lesson plan to make available upon request, as I said, for teachers who are interested in using the material in their classrooms. All right, so I'll show you a few different examples of the documents. I think it should be on. All right, well, I'll just say that we're going to potentially use these. We haven't made the final decision, and my gloss on them will be a bit truncated for the purposes of time. But first, here's a page from the report of the examination of Josephine Smith, who is a 16-year-old woman, incarcerated at age 15, actually, who was incarcerated for incorrigibility. The form details biographical information such as Josephine's age, current home, religion, educational history, and is most concerned with her family history and personal history in this section, providing narratives for both Josephine's relationships with her father, mother, and brother. What's more, in documenting some factual details about Josephine's move from her birthplace in South Carolina to New York, or more specifically Long Island, the form also provides a window into the history of migration of African Americans living in the southern United States to the urban north, as well as the placing of those recent migrants in urban centers such as New York. When students encounter this examination report, then, the goal is to have given them some framing historical information about migration to the urban north, so in sort of the historical context we provide to the students, as well as to allow the students to look closely at how both the institution staff and Josephine herself frame her life experiences. So my sort of reading of the report is that the staff is drawing attention to the disorder and need for reform in Josephine's life in New York, for which they sort of believe she's ill-equipped coming from the South. And this isn't the full form, this is just part of it that I could get on the PowerPoint. So a question that the educator might pose to the student is, when the prison staff writes a narrative about Josephine's family members and Josephine, what do they focus on exactly? Here the teachers and students might look specifically at the emphasis on a quote-unquote good home and accounts of Josephine's mother and father in the South. Do these references imply perhaps that Josephine and her grandmother, who's also come up with her to New York, are out of place in the city? The educator facilitating the discussion might also draw students' attention to how Josephine represents herself in this interview, as the report frequently quotes her within its own narrative summaries. What sort of information about Josephine is left out of the report? Do students think that Josephine might hold back information or represent herself or her family in a certain way during the interview, and why? The fact that Josephine ran away from home and lived and worked on her own was clearly viewed negatively, as she was arrested for that. But were there any moments in the report where Josephine seemed to assert her independence despite the judgment of the criminal justice system? And here I'm thinking of her decision to take her mother's maiden name. So the report reads, "I liked the sound of Smith better than I liked Waiver, and I took it for my name," and didn't take her father's name. By providing a broader historical context and guiding the students through some methods for reading the documents to understand the different perspectives and power relations represented, the hope is that students have the experience of discovering a somewhat alien and strange archival document from the past with the educator, while also picking up tools for making sense of and responding to those records. They also hopefully begin to get a sense of the social judgments and narratives that go into labeling someone as quote-unquote criminal, or in this case, incorrigible. And my second example might give students a window into how young women negotiated their relationships to their families and communities while they were incarcerated. Here's a letter from a young woman named Gladys Case, who we have less information about from the box of records. To guide the discussion here, the instructor or facilitator might ask the students, what is the tone of the letter? Does Gladys appear sad, curious, indifferent? Why? What does she say to her mother, and what does she leave out? Do you think her mention of training and her omission of punishment is purposeful? Why or why not? How does she describe the other girls in the institution? So far, what is her impression of social life and maybe life in general at the training school? How does Gladys address her family? Why do you think the PS section is longer than the actual body of the letter? And how do you think Gladys' absence affects those she refers to in her letter? So her mother, her grandparents, etc. And finally, because I mentioned that we wanted to include visual material in the workshop, I also wanted to show you two photographs that were also recovered from the box of records, which provide a really interesting window into the relationship that the young women formed within the training school itself, which often continued after their time together in prison. So this is a photo of a woman, a young woman who we simply know as Dazzle, who had been incarcerated at the training school. And we see her striking two poses on what seemed to be a similar but not quite the same park bench. So here's the first, and then back, and here's the second.
Sorry, I'm too old.
It's okay. All right, so the back of the first photo reads, Don't you want to keep me company? I'm awfully lonesome sitting here alone. This dress is blue silk. You'd never think it, though, would you? I'll write soon all the love in the world to you, dear, from me, dear. Always yours, Dazzle. And the back of the other photograph reads, do you know I feel the way I look? Jimmy took that. Cute pose, don't you think? Am I fat or what? Have I changed? With love, dear, from old pal Dazzle. Reading these photographs in conjunction with their written notes, which express affection and intimacy between two young women, starting with the nickname Dazzle itself, a common practice for women incarcerated at Hudson at the time to give each other sort of almost familial nicknames, might allow students to think about how those incarcerated forged relationships asserted their sexuality and independence in ways that countered the roles the court system and the staff of the training school had set out for them, despite their imprisonment. What sort of cute pose is Dazzle striking anyway? You could ask the students. What sort of relationship do the students imagine Dazzle and the recipient of her picture or pictures as having? How does Dazzle ask her friend to help her make sense of her time incarcerated when she writes, quote, have I changed? And the final step in the workshop that we're planning with these materials is giving students a chance to construct their own interpretations and creative responses to the archival documents that they've encountered and hopefully gotten a chance to look at inquisitively and critically. And I would say this is a segment of the project that we're really still developing. And recently, Tracy and Brian suggested that one of the Prison Public Memory Project's other collaborators, Toby Jacoby, who is an English and composition professor at Colorado State University, and actually writing on the materials in the Jerky box, that she might want to collaborate with us on this activity, as she had previously led some zine-making workshops. So the idea right now is to have students actually create zines, so the sort of the miniature magazines, and narratives, either on their own if they'd like, or with a smaller group of students, that might include copies of the images and text they've encountered, and create a narrative response to the lives of the young women who are incarcerated. So whether recreating the life of the young woman, sort of imagining her experiences, or linking those experiences to their own lives, current events, and so forth. Before beginning work on this portion of the project, I really wasn't as familiar with zines as a genre, but it actually turns out that Barnard Library has a huge collection of them, and librarians who specialize in them. So I'm definitely planning to get in touch with them and explore that as a resource. And they actually have lesson plans online as well about using zines. Anyway, as I've learned a little bit more myself about this format, what I think is interesting and exciting about a zine as a teaching and creative tool is that it has a hybrid form, which can incorporate photos, written narrative, and drawing, and it also has a history of being circulated to protest political issues or build a social movement. So when the workshop facilitators ask the students to engage with the zine's hybrid form, I think it gives them an opportunity to ask students how the zine's construction differs, from something like the form of a case file, which often contains, different textual narratives and photographs itself, and who the students see as the audience for their zine, what they believe its purpose might be, and so forth. Thus, they get a chance to sort of consider how they're creating their own documents and archive that might construct or evoke the past in a way that's different from the way the records in the Jerky box are constructed. And finally, as I've mentioned, we're planning to invite the students to exhibit the work that they create on the Prison Public Memory Project's website, if they'd like to participate in that. Okay, so I think I'll leave the talk here. I'm happy to talk more sort of about the future directions for the projects that are in discussion in the Q&A. And on a concluding note, I just wanted to say that having the opportunity to collaborate on this project with the Prison Public Memory Project and engaging in the shared, messy, creative work of the public humanities more generally has given me a window into how the form and method that we use in making the past public, whether as academics or teachers or as an organization, is important and needs our care, attention, and energy. Go ahead.
What area you study is that you are emphasizing? Women's studies, American institutional history, or just plain education?
In terms of the teaching materials?
Yeah, in terms of, because it looks to me like curriculum development,
Mm-hmm.
but I also have experience because I used to work with Juan Monilla in the Center in CUNY, Center for American Studies,
Great.
and we did work in New Haven, Connecticut, women's prison.
Oh, great.
And it's just all those elements come out into my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Although I was not actually participating, I just observed it because most was conducted by Puerto Rican and Dominican women of 70s and 80s. So
Oh.
you know, it brings, because everything is feminist studies and this and the other thing. But that is excellent because the whole thing of bringing in the workshop participants to start identifying themselves with the subject.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably some subject will be participating in the workshop. I don't know what is on the workshop. It helps to develop professionally sustainable staff, which in prison is very difficult.
Right. No.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm very specific too.
Yeah, so we definitely thank you. That sounds like great work. And I think part of the use of these materials in a classroom setting that we want to sort of develop a sense of collaboration among the students and some sort of identification with the people's lives that they're looking at through these archival records, but also, you know, to think about sort of how those lives might be different from now, you know, how history has kind of changed since then, and sort of, you know, both making connections with the past, but also looking at sort of differences in the way that the prison system is working in our
And your level is postdoctoral or predoctoral?
I'm pre-doctoral.
Okay,
Yes.
good. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, yes. Other questions?
Miss Gladys Case. So did she type that herself?
I think that she did. So Brian might have thoughts about this as well, but I'm guessing that, you know, they had a typewriter for students to like learn typewriting, and it might have been part of sort of a training program in terms of getting students jobs afterwards. I don't. I mean,
That's 1923, right? Around there. I would say definitely a Remington.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I think, you know, I'm not completely sure. Most of the letters are handwritten, so this is an exception, and I have to admit that I use it because it's so sort of clear for the presentation so that everybody can read. Usually when you go through this material, you're like kind of peering at bad handwriting, but yeah, I would guess that either, you know, it was part of a training program, or she could have dictated it to one of the staff members. So obviously that is a good question because it helps, you know, if we talked about like why did she type it up, and, you know, again, like is there material that she's leaving out because she's dictating it to a staff member and so forth. Yeah, do you have anything else to say about it?
You went exactly.
Yeah.
Can I follow up?
Yeah, of
Why
course.
does it say box 756 on
I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably her postbox, you know, either for the institution or for...
it? Would it be like a facsimile of what she sent to her mother?
Mhm. Yes, it would be a facsimile. Brian, do you have any more information about that? Or?
Yeah, so they definitely would have been typed as part of the training program.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually photographs of all of the girls, you know, learning how to type. And they were using that not only to type up letters, but also for correspondence between the girls. And then one other important element with these letters, as they were going out, to be aware of is that there was very much an element of surveillance. All of the letters were being read, both that were coming in and that were going out.
Right. And usually, like, for my own work, I know, like, at the reformatory, you would have a list of family members, and those were the only, you know, people that you could correspond with. You couldn't correspond with a boyfriend or something like that. Question in the back?
Yeah, I apologize if you didn't go over this, but
Oh, no worries.
I'm just curious if you could talk more about any plans you do have to teach those kinds of materials in like juvenile
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, we've been thinking about that possibility, and it's really about sort of, I think, creating a relationship with a particular program. So, you know, I know that there's been work being done at Columbia with Inside Out, or creating kind of an Inside Out program at Rikers with young people who are incarcerated as juveniles. I think there's like a certain danger with like just being like, hey, you guys are in prison, so why don't you read about these other people who are also in prison. I think that there has to be an interest, and that teachers sort of need to set up, or program facilitators have to make sure that the students are interested in that. But yeah, I think that it's definitely something that the organization would be interested in pursuing. And yeah, I think after we finish the workshop in Hudson, our next step will be to sort of think about what the next classroom setting will be sort of targeting with these materials and that's everything.
Do you have any data on older versus older women?
The data on the women in the records?
Yeah, because most of the time they are forgotten.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely, so there hasn't been like a book-length study written about the Hudson Training School, and I think that's why the Prison Public Memories Project's work is so important, because they're doing that sort of archival research, going through census records, looking at the log books, and everything like that. And if you read the institution's annual reports, so that's really where a lot of the statistics are about, like how many women were incarcerated, and that sort of thing. Yeah, so. Do you have a specific question about like the demographics or anything like that?
The issue is that I observed that different states and different people in different areas deal with that cycle of incarceration, which can be long or short, differently. In the same in Australia. Australia have they play a progressive way of dealing with that kind, in which at some point they let the women who are much older go home, regardless of the penalty they have.
Right.
And that's what and they sometimes they present it more in the different cultural expressions like movies and programs and special programs, things like that, than I noticed in the United States. Everybody's beautiful or a superhero, so but it's
true.
So, yeah. But it's you have to deal with that, because we're gonna be dealing with that pretty soon here.
Yeah, I mean, just historically looking at this material is interesting, because this is a prison for young women 12 to 15 years old, but the progressive era reformers were really obsessed with sort of sorting people by age and reformability. So you definitely see that when you look through these records, that recognition. Other questions? Go ahead.
I was really intrigued by a comment you had early on about when you first sort of encountered some of these archives and being struck by the things that were left out about these people's lives. I just really wanted to hear more than that, because it struck me that in some way this is perhaps a population that has a disproportionate amount of paperwork of certain kinds about them.
Right.
But so I'm interested in what are these sort of lacunae, the things that you noticed as being sort of intentionally written or left out or erased?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think, that the case files that you look at are often sort of a struggle for narrative control between the institution staff who are trying to sort of sculpt or sort of force these women's lives into a certain narrative arc of like being reformed or, being incarcerated for a period of time. And then, the way that women who were incarcerated were sort of pushing back on that, and I don't know, sort of living lives otherwise, even within the confines of the institution. And you see little moments of that, but it's harder to trace that. You have to look on like disciplinary reports to see like what people were being punished for, and the letters that have been sort of censored or torn up and kept in the file. That those are sort of experiences that you can get sort of short glimpses into how women were sort of conceiving of their own lives differently than reformers. So that would be sort of what I would say I meant by that. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talks. Super interesting. And I just wanted to ask, like, a lot of these cases seem to be like they strike us now as being a little quaint, right? Like someone being incarcerated for being
Right.
or a little promiscuous. And I'm just wondering like how you deal with that pedagogically, like that kind of historic dissonance between like how you perceive, like say an archive, an archive on present day, you know, incarcerated woman versus something like this, which, you know, I mean, it almost seems like they're leading a pretty nice, like, fun life at camp, you know?
Right,
like, you know,
right.
benefits of summer camp. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you make that difference, like, very good, you know, that contrast should be something you talk about in the classroom. You know, why do you think it was that it, you know, that they were kind of using this structure to form kids? And I think also, especially for this material, it's important to remember that it's the juvenile justice system, which I think it has, you know, obviously it's evolved to be like a much more sort of penalized, like a super sort of prison structure, you know, and resembles like a penitentiary or something like that. But children are still being incarcerated for like disorderly conduct or sort of charged with smaller petty offenses that might lead them to spend some time in a house or a halfway house or something like that. So I think that that's something to bring into the classroom as well when you're giving background contextualization about sort of the history of imprisonment and the way it's evolved. But yeah, I mean, definitely don't want students to leave with the impression that like it was actually way better back in the day and that you know, that kids got off easy or something like that. Yeah. I mean,
so do you have a sense of what people were in there for? I mean, you know, like, so we were just talking now, right, this person in need of supervision, right? So it sounds like the incorrigible, you know, disobedient child could end up there, like, in the reform school. On the one hand, and like, so, but how serious offense would it? They go there instead of someplace else. Do you mean like if somebody had, I don't know, you know, had been accused and convicted of murder, would not end up someplace like this, right? Even if she was a juvenile, or maybe I'm asking you a question other than.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know the juvenile system as well as sort of the later reformatory system, but I think that you know, if the woman was over 16 and she committed murder, she would be sent to the penitentiary. But the frequency of incarceration, like most women and young girls were incarcerated very frequently for like disorderly conduct, which is another way of saying prostitution, or incorrigibility, which is again like, oh, she's in danger of having her morals depraved. Like she might be a loose woman or kind of. And I think also at Hudson there are girls, you know, there for petty thefts and other sort of minor crimes like that. Brian, do you have any sort of extra information about that?
Well, I think one important element is that it depends a lot on the year. Back in the 20s, I think this was still before Brookwood Disciplinary Annex was built, also in Hudson, actually, which is where things like murder cases were gone to. But at the time, in the 20s, it was a huge range. I mean, it was status, or what we call status offenses, but anything up to probably, and including murder. And Gladys is not exaggerating there. At one point, it was the largest juvenile prison in the country, with over 400 girls. So they were there for any kinds of reasons, and they were all grouped in together. There was really no discrimination about, you know, this girl would end up in this cottage because of why she was sent there. Everybody was put in hodgepodge.
You know, another thing that is positive is that in this kind of work, the messenger is as impactful as the message. And a person like you that is a woman that is feminine and knows how to deal, raise your voice, and things like that. When you present this material, it tends to be seminal for a lot of people who listens to it. Or you publish it, or whatever you want to do with it, because it's needed. It's definitely needed.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that, right, we're trying to create sort of these lesson plans and sort of write up sort of some history for teachers to use so that, you know, other classrooms can have access to that. Other questions?
I'll follow one more tug at the institutional fabric.
Okay.
Who is this Jimmy who takes Dazzle's photo?
I mean, he's a mystery man. assume. You know, he could be a boyfriend, he could be a brother, or an acquaintance. And it is interesting because, you know, the notes on the back of the photos sort of, you know, have a sense of intimacy and affection and, you know, maybe even some romance, so that he's sort of inserted into that narrative or that relationship. And yeah, I think it would be a good question to ask students, like, who is Jimmy? What do you think his role is as a photographer and, you know, as a potential beau or something? And, you know, how is the young woman sort of framing her sexuality around that pose that she's striking for him? Yeah, it's a good question.
I'd like to ask a question about how you think about getting students to relate to these materials in such a way that it's not just them talking about their own experience, but actually sort of forcing it in a certain way to put themselves in that historically embodied framework. So I wonder, not for the answer, but how you guys thought about how much contextual information is necessary for each document, what's too much information, what's too little information. How do you think about those questions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I don't have every answer for it, but I think, you know, in terms of the historical context that we're giving students, the way that we're talking about setting up the workshop now is to have the first portion of time be sort of a discussion and maybe even some lecture about sort of, this is the time period that we were looking at, these are sort of the, you know, people are immigrating to the city, people are migrating, this is what the Hudson Training School was, and why juvenile delinquency became such a thing. It's so important to reformers in the city at that time. Yeah, so that the students have that information as they're looking at the documents. I think, you know, in terms of not just, you know, we don't want to sort of be like, okay, so how do you see these documents as relating to your experience and your experience only? And I think that way is just to sort of think about the people that they're documenting as characters, or, you know, to sort of flesh out their experience and ask as many questions about it as we can as we're looking at the documents. That would be sort of my, and perhaps to sort of weave in some of the information that we talked about sort of the historical context as we look at the documents as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Just back to Gladys Case, is that right?
Gladys.
The time in which the letter is written and also the frequency, it seems, of communication between her and her mom, at least at this time of year, is rather high, right? She knows that her grandma and grandpa are sick from Christmas, and this is right before New Year's, so presumably there's been a lot of communication. Have you considered taking, sort of looking at documents with the students in a kind of aggregate form to sort of see whether there are certain moments at which their communication does seem to have a higher frequency and then sort of wanes or something of the sort, and what that might tell them? Or?
That's a really interesting idea. I do think, like, that the communication frequency that's happening in this letter is because she's just been incarcerated, so that, you know, she's kind of in touch with, she knows what's going on with her family, from what I can tell at least, that she's describing her initial impressions of Hudson and that sort of thing. And I think it would be really interesting to write, to look at the letters from different girls writing home and see when they're writing and sort of if there's overlap about events in the prison or something like that. However, I don't think there's enough material in this box to facilitate that. But I think, you know, as we, you know, as the Prison Public Memory Project sort of gathers more archival documents, perhaps that would be a great activity.
Miss Emily, was this the time around the era of Bonnie and Clyde?
I guess.
We had the picture just right.
Yeah, it's a bit early. This is early. It is early, but yeah. Was there a question over? Did you? Okay.
I'm interested in your conversation about the oral history work that you've done, that the project has done, and where it figures in this, thinking about work with students.
Okay, so I haven't done any of that work, so I don't want to take credit for that. Brian, do you want to talk about that, or?
My question is actually somewhat more targeted. Like, when you think about what students would interact with, was there a conversation about some of that material being from the oral history work, or did that just seem not part of your plans?
I mean, when we talked about it, we just decided that, you know, we wanted to focus on race and gender in this particular time period, so that this collection of documents seems the most appropriate. And I know that oral history are mainly of staff members who worked in the 1960s, so that's a more complex, I think, body of materials in terms of fleshing out the institutional life and everyday life there. I definitely think that students could work with it, and that would be really interesting. It's just about determining like what classroom that would be appropriate for. Brian, do you have anything you want to say about that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think looking at it on a larger scale, one thing that would be really interesting that I was thinking about for the what is omitted question is one thing that is omitted are the particular aspects of institutional life that they don't want put in the letters. So, for instance, at the training school, it'd be the same-sex romantic and sexual partnerships that were forming between the girls, and that's something in oral history it's really tough to get the staff members to talk about it, but they're talking about it, and so having those oral histories and being able to pair that with this sort of institutional history, you start to see things come out of those words in these letters and in these case files that wouldn't come out otherwise if you didn't have that, those types of oral histories, those types of histories.
Thank you.
One quick question. Are we using public memory and social history interchangeably, or is there a distinction between the two? Because based on your question about what is omitted and what you just said, I'm now kind of confused as to what's happening here. And tying that into what you said earlier about the role of incarceration in the U.S., can you tie that into some kind of fleshing out a little bit?
Okay, so the question
so social
is...
history, public memory, social history, and then the role of incarceration in the U.S. How does that follow?
Okay, so I would say, the public memory piece is kind of this a broad umbrella for the work that the Prison Public Memory Project is doing. So it's recovering, sort of cultural memories, institutional records that have, traces of different experiences and so forth that we can read through them. And looking at a bunch of different contexts, really, at these different prisons and sort of recovering that cultural memory as it relates to prisons. And I think like the social history is what we would use in the classroom to talk about the documents that we're looking at, and to think about how, the records are being recorded, whose experiences are getting written up in a certain way, how can we kind of read them against the grain. And I don't know, I would say that I don't really have a term for that that's either public memory or social history. I see those two things as kind of tied together anyways. So, yeah. Does that help at all, or sort of? Okay. Sure.
So, can you talk a little bit more about how this project and how your dissertation, how one has helped you think better about the other?
Yeah, sure. I think this project has really helped me think about how I'm making the records that I'm working with from the Wiki Collaboratory, which is another women's prison in New York State, that I'm focusing on in my dissertation, how I'm making those records public, even within the form of a dissertation. So sort of using those records and bringing them to light, but also not trying to just sort of be like, hey, this is cool, sort of learning how to read them against the grain to sort of, do justice to some of those experiences of the women that were incarcerated without sort of replicating the form of the records themselves, or sort of being like a staff sociologist and studying the women. So yeah, I think it's made me much more cognizant of the way that I'm making records public, basically just thinking about writing, academic writing itself as a form of publication, and sort of the messy and difficult process of that. Other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.